Venezuela has been hit by a wave of economic problems, with the two most pressing issues being the high inflation and the scarcity of goods. That being said, Venezuela always had economic problems to begin with. In fact, most of its problems are interwoven and are the result of the left-wing political ideology Chavismo. And although the late President Hugo Chavez did rebuild the country, he did so by inadvertently creating an economic bubble. So what's important to understand here is that President Maduro did not create but inherit the current economic crisis from Chavez, much like Obama inheriting the economic crisis from Bush in 2008. For example, the inflation issue, which is actually at the center of the crisis, dates back all the way to the 1980s. The reason why it's making headlines now is because since taking the presidency, Maduro's administration has effectively doubled that number to 56% for 2013. But in truth, this growth is out of the government's hands because they no longer have control over the ongoing currency bubble in the country. Welcome to Caspian Report for Maidan TV by me, Shirvan. For more information, visit the social media pages. So the currency bubble in Venezuela is a bit technical, but it all comes down to inflation. Now what you have to realize here is that inflation is not new to Venezuelan economics. It started as a result of the Dutch disease in the 1980s when Saudi Arabia, in cooperation with the United States, artificially collapsed the oil prices to cripple the Soviet Union's economic dependency on oil exports. And it worked. The USSR became an economic cripple, but this also had an influence on every oil exporting country in the world, including Venezuela. And so when the oil prices collapsed, the economy of Venezuela contracted and inflation skyrocketed. This is also why so many Venezuelan politicians blame the US for their economic issues. Anyway, the inflation peaked during the 1990s, when it reached about 100% in 1996, and as you can imagine, the country was a mess. Poverty was everywhere. That is until Hugo Chavez came to power a few years later. He managed to reduce inflation to about 20-25% annually, but he did so by imposing a control mechanism on capital flight. Just to be clear, capital flight means people transferring their money or assets out of a country in order to protect their finances against an increase in taxes or a government that is on the brink to default on its debts. And usually it's the middle class and upper class that engages in capital flight. One more important thing that can be said on capital flight is that historically the biggest transfers have been observed in countries where a socialist movement or a socialist party dominates the country. Obviously, the upper class doesn't want to share its assets and decides to transfer it all. And given Latin America's long historical leftist socialist affiliations, capital flight is a major economic issue in all of Latin America. And one consequence of capital flight is that it creates a shortage of wealth in a country, and this results in a sharp decline in the exchange rate, which basically means the devaluation of the national currency. So the higher the capital flight is, the more the national currency devaluates. And as a consequence of this, ordinary citizens lose a chunk of their nominal value over their assets. This in turn leads to a dramatic decline in purchasing power of the country's assets, and thus makes it more and more expensive to import goods. And this final phase translates into an ever-growing inflation. When the oil prices collapsed in the 1980s, Venezuela witnessed a huge transfer of assets. It's estimated that the country lost a full year's worth of income through capital flight. That is how much of an issue this is in Caracas. So what did Chavez do to stop this? Well, he tried to reform the economy, but then there was a coup attempt which created even more political instability, and the upper class panicked, and this resulted in even more capital flight and thus even more inflation. So the government decided to fight inflation by intervening in the currency market, because that's where the problem lied. This meant that the government in Caracas used its foreign reserves to buy its own currency, the bolivar, in order to stabilize the currency. This economic policy is practiced throughout the world, and it's basically the government manipulating the value of its currency to its own citizens. And obviously controlling the currency rate by artificial means is not all that effective. But it was a start because inflation did drop, and so the government decided to pursue this strategy by establishing a new mechanism in 2003 to control the currency rate, and this is where the CADIVI comes in the picture. This was Chavez's answer to halt capital flight. He established a state-run exchange bureau who would grant its citizens a limited number of dollars at low rates. But there were certain conditions attached to it. For example, you could only buy American dollars if you were traveling, if you wanted to import certain goods, or if you needed to pay off foreign debts, etc. And what happened is that people quickly realized a loophole in the system and established a whole new black market exchange. One could effectively buy a plane ticket as evidence for travel plans and then buy an American dollar for 6 bolivars from the government and then turn around and sell that same dollar at the black market for at least 60 bolivars. That's an extremely high profit margin, and that bubble has only been growing. And it's a very easy way to exploit the system, and it's mostly practiced by the country's middle class and upper class. And in the meantime, this practice depletes the country's foreign currency reserves because the CADIVI is owned by the government. So how does this link to the shortage of commodities? Well, the danger with an economic bubble is that people get creative and find a loophole within the loophole. And that's what's happening in Venezuela right now. A major portion of the imported and produced goods are exported or smuggled to neighboring countries like Colombia, where the goods are then sold for American dollars. The smugglers return to Venezuela and sell the American dollars at tenfold profit margins at the black market. And this isn't just for imported goods, but it also applies to domestically produced goods. For example, a Venezuelan farmer who produces milk and meat sells his goods for double the price to smugglers. These smugglers take the goods to Colombia and get paid in American dollars. The smugglers then return to Venezuela and sell those dollars at the black market. And this is the loophole within the bubble. So even though the country is importing and producing at a normal rate, the amount of goods that gets exported and smuggled to neighboring countries is so high that it creates a shortage of goods within the country itself. And right now, exporting or smuggling is perhaps the most lucrative business in Venezuela. And the more dire the situation gets, the more shortages there are, the more lucrative this whole system gets. And so what you've got here is too much of the national currency chasing too few goods. And this results in higher and higher inflation. And that's what's really going on in Venezuela. It's a bubble within a bubble that is part of the whole financial system. And the only reason why Venezuela can keep this up is because of its oil revenues. As long as the oil industry keeps going, this bubble can essentially continue. But what is in fact happening is that all of the country's energy wealth is being wasted to feed this system. So President Maduro's attempt to fix this issue was by replacing the finance minister Giordani with mathematician Merentes in April 2013. These two people could not be more different. Giordani is considered one of the architects of this whole fixed currency rating system and is ideologically driven, whereas Merentes wanted to open up the foreign exchange market and has a more pragmatic approach. Merentes' policy was the devaluation of the Bolivar currency to its normal global rates. And even though this policy would have resulted in much higher inflation rates, some might even call it hyperinflation, this strategy was meant to end the whole system. Merentes argued that the main problem was not exporting or smuggling. No, that was the symptom. The main problem was the whole government-owned fixed currency system. That was the cause of the disease, and he meant to put an end to that. And since this was against the legacy of Chavez, Merentes was dismissed from office by October 2013. So this economic reform was never implemented, and instead the country returned to business as usual, which basically meant keep feeding the bubble. So where do the protests fit in all this? Well, when Maduro came to power, he implied several measures to end the exploitation of the CADIVI. The middle class and upper class were obviously very angry over this decision, and this explains why the majority of the protesters are from the middle class and upper class and not from the lower class of the country. In a previous Caspian report, we explained how the opposition is using the economic factor as their platform to launch a campaign against President Maduro. But the truth is, it doesn't matter who is in charge of Venezuela. There is no easy way to undo a decade-long economic system. This is a vicious cycle that cannot be broken without hyperinflation. It cannot be broken without completely redesigning the financial sector, and whoever attempts to reform it will commit political suicide. There will be riots, there will be mass demonstrations from all classes of the country, and this is why the government is content with doing business as usual. This was a Caspian report for Meydan TV by me, Shirvan. If you're looking for more information on Caspian report or Meydan TV, visit the social media pages in the description section, and as always, thanks for watching and sağ ol.